10 years. And I want to also introduce Chris Tyson. And now, Chris, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm a postdoc here. I graduated in 2018 now, so I've been a postdoc for the past couple of years, and I also work on various things with low mass stars.
So we're both in physics and astronomy, so there may be some differences between the sort of paths and issues that we discuss in the physical sciences than in, say, engineering or other physical science fields. So, we'll have some time for discussion. In fact, I think most of the time we're going to sort of set up for discussion today. So we're happy to kind of discuss the different variants of academic jobs and academic trajectories that can be out there. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. Let's see. Unfortunately, you're going to get to see all the many tabs that I have open on my browser. So again, today is really to talk about academic career options. I want to emphasize that next week there'll be discussion about industry career options. And so I think it's actually worth going to both of these, because one of the things that I will kind of mention at the beginning here is that academic jobs are actually kind of hard to get. And that's really just a numbers game. And so it's always important to have sort of, as you're sort of thinking about your transition out of your PhD or maybe out of a postdoc position, what are this full spectrum of options that you have for careers that are based on your particular area of expertise. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about a typical academic path, and I put that in quotes because there's actually a wide variety of academic paths. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my path, and I think maybe Chris can mention a little bit about his path to the point where he's at now. I'm going to be a little bit honest about the realities of academic career options and kind of what the statistics show today, just to kind of keep in mind that there are challenges in getting academic jobs because there's just very few of them. And so we want to sort of make sure you understand the numbers of that. And then, with that in mind, what are the skills that you should be developing now or have developed now that will really increase your chance of securing an academic job if that's the route you want to take. And I'll talk about other issues. And then again, I think my goal is to have as much of this time to really have a discussion about different kinds of academic careers than just a didactic presentation. So at least in physics and maybe more generally in the physical sciences, this is kind of the sort of traditional path that many folks talk about in terms of going from your PhD to a faculty or research scientist position. So as you probably know, it takes some number of time to get your PhD in the first place. So depending on which area you work in, it could be 4 years, it could be 7 years, it could be more. And then at least in the physical sciences, it's very typical to have a postdoctoral position after that. And I should say when I first got my PhD, at the time, it was typical to have 1 or 2 postdoctoral positions. It was increasingly more common for folks to have 2 positions before they transition into a faculty position. I've now seen that increase to, in some cases, 3 postdoctoral positions. So you're talking in some cases up to 9 years between your PhD and a permanent job. This is a worrying trend. And I think people are thinking very deeply about how to make sure that folks can get into permanent positions as opposed to these temporary positions. I should say that at least from a research perspective, the postdoc position is actually, for me, it was a very thrilling time because my only job was to do research and to really focus on that aspect of that. But at the same time, it's also a little bit disruptive because it's often a temporary position where you may be moving around. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. And then typically then, if you do move into academia, you'll be in an untenured position, either faculty or teaching faculty, research scientist. And then after some number of years, depending on how the tenure cycle sort of is sort of designed for your particular program, you'll go on to a tenured position. So, look at the time scales. We're talking about years into the future. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. I received tenure, I think about 5 years ago. And I've been working in this field for about 25 years at this point. So it took about 20 years from the first time I started working in astrophysics to get a tenured position. So it's a long period to get to that permanent position, but it's something to consider. And also that this varies dramatically across different fields, across even subfields within fields. It really depends on sort of the ecosystem of that particular career. And let me just quickly, bring up this graph. This is my physical academic path. And so I originally came from the East Coast. I came out to UCSD as an undergraduate. because it was about the farthest place I can get from Buffalo, New York, as I could find on the map. And then I got my PhD at Caltech, and then I went back to the East Coast and got a job out in New York and a first faculty position at MIT, and then I came back here. So there's a lot of bouncing back. And of course, that is going to be dependent on your ability to travel. It depends on, of course, your family situation. Are you close to your family? Do you have a you're traveling with? What your partner's job career is. So there's a lot of factors that involve in this. So again, I put typical in quotes because I can really only describe my path, but your path may differ quite considerably. Chris, do you want to kind of maybe just describe a little bit what your path has been up to this point?
Sure. I was also an undergrad at UCLA, and I went out to Boston for my PhD. And then my wife got a faculty job here in San Diego. So then we came back to San Diego. So I didn't jump around as much as Adam, but you kind of go where the jobs are if you want to follow the academic path. It's not crazy for people to apply to 10 grad schools, as many of you did, or more, and then maybe double that for your postdocs, and you just see what lands. And the same thing goes for every step here. When you're applying for faculty jobs, you're going to apply for everything that you can stomach. Yeah.
It's a good way to phrase it. Yeah. So, and we'll talk a little bit about the sort of, what are the actual opportunities that are out there today. But this is definitely something to keep in mind, is that when you're thinking about pursuing this path, it may require some pretty big changes in your life in terms of where you live and how you move. I have many colleagues that didn't have to move very much at all. They happen to be an area where there's lots of positions, and you've noticed that both Chris and I have spent time in Southern California and in Boston, and part of that is that there's just a lot of academic institutions in those areas. So, so this is something that you should be considering in you planning your path: is what is important for my career, and also what is important for me personally, right? Where am I going to be happy as I'm making these transitions, these different stages. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the reality of academic jobs. So in most academic jobs in physical sciences and engineering, a PhD is, of course, required. And so if you look at the number of PhDs that are offered and the number of faculty jobs that are offered, and the PhDs are in blue and the faculty jobs are in orange, you can see these are diverging quite rapidly. So I think sometime in the 1980s is a good time to just get a PhD, you're going to be guaranteed an academic job. That time is long past. At this point, there's something on order of 35,000 PhDs awarded in STEM across all STEM fields per year, and only about 3,000 faculty jobs on offer each year. So we're looking at a 10-to-1 ratio at this point. So it's important to just keep that in mind, right? That the reality is that, it's going to be on order of 10% of folks who get PhDs that will even have an opportunity to get an academic job, at least jobs, right? So there's many other kinds of academic jobs that we'll talk about in just a moment. But it's important to keep that reality in mind, right? So, if your passion is become faculty job, I can strongly encourage that passion, but just make sure that you have other options, because it's just a really difficult numbers game in this current environment. Here's some more statistics about academic careers. This is specifically for physics. And so this is from a study by the AP Statistical Research Center, showing the initial employment type for different sectors 1 year after the PhD. So you can see in terms of academics, you can see this, the traditional trajectory is to first go into a postdoc. So 75% of the folks who are postdocs are in academia. That makes sense. But that's also the majority of folks who are moving out of their first year PhD if they're following the academic track. When you look at potentially permanent positions, right, that switches quite dramatically over to industry. So here we can see that there's about 20% of the folks that were who had gotten jobs in academia. And I should say that's much more broad than faculty positions. That includes research scientists, teaching faculty, other sort of staff that are involved in academia. All right, so that's a broader field, but only about 20% of folks 1 year out of their PhD had moved into a potentially permanent academic position. And then you can see there's lots of other places for jobs there. The right side also panel shows another important factor, at least for the physicist, is that the majority of folks who move into permanent positions actually move into positions that are not related to physics. So the majority move into things like engineering, computer science, business, education, medical science. So you may find that even though you've gotten this training as a physicist, your skill set is actually very important for other fields. And you may find that you're transitioning to a completely different field if you're going for that permanent route. So it's just, I bring this up because it's important to understand that there are lots of options. And it may be that you find yourself in a position that's not a faculty position at an academic institution, but you're still doing something that's related to your research or your interests, just in a different environment. There's also an important motivation for that is, so actually here's another framework of this to show that what I talked about, this sort of 1 in 10 issue. This is the academic employment across fields. So this is the percentage of folks who get PhDs in different fields who have a commitment to an academic position, right? And you can see that, if you're in the humanities or arts or other sort of non-science engineering fields, you have about a 70 to 80% chance of getting an academic position. But down here at the bottom is engineering and physical sciences, right? So it's about, again, about 15% for engineering and 25% for physical sciences. And that includes all academic jobs. So I keep emphasizing that you want to make sure that you are considering all your options, because the reality is there's just not many academic jobs available. Academic sphere is not growing at the same rate industry sphere is growing. And so you want to make sure that you really think about all the other possibilities you can have for academic jobs. Now, one thing, a benefit of that is that if you look at the actual salaries, if money is an important aspect to you, and that's one of the considerations you should definitely consider, when you look at the salaries of academic positions, and I'll focus here on physical sciences, not surprisingly, postdoc positions are a lower salary, but it's not much lower than faculty positions or other academic positions like research scientists in physical sciences. Those in industry, and again, this is 1 year out of their PhD, typically make up almost twice as much as postdocs and faculty members do. So there's a lot of opportunity in industry, even in the current pandemic. The same thing happens over here in engineering. It's a little bit better for academic folks, but you can see that industry folks are still making much more. So, the purpose of this session is to talk about academic careers. And I don't want to say that don't think about it, because I just, there is definitely academic jobs out there, but I just want to make sure that you're thinking about the entire ecosystem and all the other possibilities that are besides academic jobs. Okay, so final point is make sure you have a backup plan. What other opportunities are there in industry, in government labs, in private labs, places like Carnegie Institute, for example, or other industries where you could actually use your skill set and have a fulfilling and potentially more, paying better career than as a faculty member. All right, so with that caveat in mind, I just want to summarize some of actually, why don't we take a point here and see if there's any questions about that, since it's a nice break point. And I think you can just unmute. Is that right, Sinai?
Just to, while people are thinking, just to reiterate the point, because I know that the talk was kind of front loaded with, like, if you want an academic job, it's going to be really hard. But certainly in the last slide, Adam showed that doesn't mean you shouldn't get a PhD. The PhD has a lot of power for you, no matter what career path you want to take. It's just a good experience in general. Like, you learn so much about yourself, let alone whatever the subfield is that you're studying in.
I've got a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Pakai.
So it looked like before there were good breakdowns of, of those who get postdocs, what do they do? And of those who get other kinds of employment after graduate school, what do they do? But I don't think it was fully contained in any of the statistics what percentage of graduate students, when they graduate, go into a postdoc period. Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, and so it's, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have it on here, but yeah, it is, when we look, it varies extremely by field, right? So if we look at physics is the one I know the best. When we look at physicists who get a PhD, I think the number is about 70% go on to postdocs.
Okay.
There's a tiny fraction that go on to permanent positions, and that's partly to do with the fact that postdoc has now just become this middle ground. And then the remainder go outside of academia. So there's actually a large number of PhDs in physics that go into some academic position. We'll include postdocs there, but only a tiny slice of them are, the potentially permanent positions of, faculty, research scientists, teaching faculty, et cetera.
Yeah, actually, that 70% is higher than I thought. I know that lots of people go outside of academia immediately, but it still seems to be pretty high staying in, at least initially.
Yeah, the number of postdoc positions has exploded over the past 20, 30 years. It's actually at some level matched the PhD rise, whereas the faculty
I see.
hires have not. Yeah. And, at some level that's good because that means there is employment after your PhD. And I should say, by the way, if you're getting an engineering and physics PhD, like your chance of employment are like 98 to 99%. Like it's so much higher than every other field. But it's off, at least for physics, it's really kind of folded into the postdoc track as that initial hire. I think in engineering, it's much higher industry out of PhD.
Yeah, I'm in math, and so it's probably even lower than physics.
Yeah,
but probably comparable.
Well, if you fold in, quants, you might suck in a lot of math PhDs.
Fair.
Thanks for the question.
Sure.
Any other questions?
Hi, Adam. This is Jen.
Hi, Jen.
I guess I was wondering, for the statistics that you've shown so far, as far as, I guess, the universities that these positions are at, are they primarily R1 universities, or does it encompass like also more the teaching focused universities?
That's a really good question, and I actually don't know the answer to that. I can imagine if you fold in, state schools, community colleges, the integral of all those positions might actually be quite high. But I actually don't know the numbers, so that's something that's worth checking.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. So let me move on then, talk a little bit about this sort of skill set. And again, I'm going to be fairly brief on this so we have some time for discussion. And so as I was kind of thinking about, both the skills that I was told to develop as I was applying for academic jobs and the skills that we see in the academic applicants we see that we're hiring today, I think there's kind of 5 main things that I saw. And I'll be interested to hear from Chris if he has some other additional things to add in there. Certainly, if you're thinking of an R1 institution like UCSD, it's really going to be almost 80% based on your research portfolio. Research is a very important thing for R1 institutions. That's why they're R1 institutions. And in some degree, that is primarily going to be in your publications. So again, speaking mostly from physics, typical for a doctorate, PhD program is to have something like 2 or 3 publications in your PhD. The expectation at the higher and faculty level, which has increased, I should say, over time, and again, it depends a lot on the field, but now we're getting up to something like 5, 10, 15 publications by the time you're going up for a faculty position. And a significant fraction of those being first author papers where you've led the research. So that's something to keep in mind, that you want to kind of keep up your research productivity and do publications. I'd like to say that, the thing that people are looking for are those high impact science and nature journals, and that won't hurt. But honestly, in some level, just having numbers, right? If you can write up a few quick studies, if you can, collaborate with someone and get sort of a nice, simple result out, in some cases, numbers will matter. And it's not a great feature of our career sphere. But people are looking for, especially R1 institutions, people are looking for the folks who can have a steady research productivity as they come in as a faculty member. And one sort of key aspect of that also to consider is that often we're looking for, if it's a hiring committee, we're looking for folks to have established themselves as independent researchers. And so there is, and I have to admit, sometimes an awkward phase where after you've gotten your PhD, you need to start working with folks other than your research advisor. And an Akamai research advisor will know that that's an important part of their careers. Sometimes it's more awkward than not, but you want to think about how you can really establish yourself as an independent researcher. So that means, finding new collaborations, perhaps ones that grow out of your PhD work, but maybe the ones that have established as part of your postdoctoral work. This also touches on the last point, is that it allows you to increase the number of mentors you have, and also ultimately the number of letters of references that you have for these hiring positions. So that's, I would say, one of the most important aspects for R1 institutions. At teaching colleges, it's actually less of an issue, although increasingly teaching colleges are also looking for faculty who have some kind of research experience so they can bring that research as part of the educational mission of those schools. The next important thing is teaching experience. Now, I imagine many of you have been a TA at some point in your graduate career, and that's good. And I should say that was actually the essential thing for me when I was applying my first faculty job. They wanted to make sure I had some teaching experience. But you may also want to take the opportunity to do some guest lecturing. So if you're working for a faculty member and both the faculty member and the department are open to it, you could consider doing a guest lecture for that course, teaching one class. I do know some postdocs will teach at local schools, and I think, Chris, you've done this, is that right? Yeah. So you can design a simple course at a community college or something like that, and that will give you quite a bit of teaching experience for your portfolio. The other thing is that there's lots of teaching training workshops, and I know Jen has gone to workshops before, but there are many options where you can get some of the sort of training on how to be an effective teacher, and particularly how to learn some of the sort of interactive, engaging teaching practices that are increasingly being used, particularly in large classroom environments. And you can have that information on your CV that you've had the specific training, so that will help with your portfolio. Now, again, it depends on your academic job. If you're applying for an R1 institution, this is still going to be important, but going to be less important than a research job. If you're applying for a teaching position, they're going to want to see that you've had teaching experience, you've run your own classroom. And if you're applying for a research scientist position, this may be completely unimportant, right? So it really depends on what kind of career or job that you're applying for, to what degree the teaching aspect matters. The other thing, of course, that, and sorry, Vaki, it looks like you had a question there.
Yeah, what is CAE?
Sorry, acronyms. That's the Center for Astronomy Education.
Gotcha, okay.
The slides, if you go to the slides, that's a link. So you can actually click on that link to find that. They have, I'm not sure when the last time they had a workshop, but they have them at Miracosta College, which is just up the coast from UCSD. So in addition, hiring happens by people. So knowing more people is always important. So networking is a very important thing. So making sure that you're giving talks at conferences, giving talks at institutions, at, even starting at the graduate school phase. But certainly as you're a postdoc, that's one of the most important things you could be doing, is to visit institutions and be talking about your research. You never know that the place that you went to, in your first year postdoc may be the place that you're applying for a job in the fourth year of your postdoc. That happened to me. I gave a talk at UCSD in my first year postdoc job. It took a while to get the job, but it was an important place to kind of get your face in, your voice in, and your research, so they know who you are when you apply. The other thing I do want to make sure to emphasize is that I hope everyone here has a professional website page, and if you don't, now is the time, because particularly as you're applying, even as you're applying for postdoc jobs, folks will look you up, and it's important to have a place where they can land that's a very easy access to what you're doing as a scientist or as an engineer. And for engineers in particular, LinkedIn is also an important website. I say this is less important for physicists, but there are areas of physics where LinkedIn does become important. And part of this is your social media curation. When I type in someone's name, if they have a LinkedIn profile, that's usually the first thing that comes up. So you might as well make that as up to date as possible. So keep that in mind in terms of preparing the social media aspect of your networking, that you have a place that people can learn more about you online, and that it's good things about you, not the last party you went to. I'd say the next thing, which is a little bit more abstract, is to really have a vision of what your academic career is to look like. What do you want to be when you're in an academic position? Is it something that you really want to focus purely on research? In that case, certainly R1 institutions are important, but you may also want to look at private research institutions, government research institutions, where that is going to be your focus is research. And for many people, that's a very, that's where their heart is and that's where they want to do the most work. If you're more interested in pure teaching, then that's when you're certainly looking at teaching universities, community colleges, CSUs, many private colleges are looking for good teachers, and they will really reward good teaching and help train your teaching. So that's a good place if you're really thinking from an educational perspective. I mean, obviously, a sort of traditional faculty position is kind of a mix of both. And that mixture will depend on what the program is, et cetera. But that's kind of where you want to sort of map out where you want to go. Think very deeply now, for the next 5-10 years, do I love research so much that's all I want to do? Or I loved teaching so much that's all I want to do? That's going to help kind of direct where you're going to go in terms of applying for post-PhD jobs. And then I think a really important aspect to start to develop now is building your network of mentors. So I think many of you have a PhD advisor. That's certainly one mentor. But you should have other mentors in your life that can advise you about all aspects of your career, right? So your PhD mentor is obviously very invested in your PhD research, but you may want to have another person who can think about what are these other options in terms of careers, or who are the people that you need to communicate with or contact with or collaborate with to kind of expand your research program. I've had mentors throughout my career, many who are very senior, and actually at this stage, many who are junior to me, because they have a different skill set, they have a different perspective on careers, and I find it very valuable just have people to kind of bounce ideas off, or can give me advice, or can even write me a letter of recommendation if I'm applying for a job or something, right? So it's important to start thinking about who are those people that maybe you're informally turning to now. And maybe you could make it a more formal mentorship relationship. Ask them, would you be willing to serve as a mentor and just talk with me every once in a while and kind of help me gauge how to steer my career? It's one of the, mentorship is one of the things that we see is extremely important for success at any level of academic careers. And it's important to kind of think about how you can do this now. And again, your research advisor is one of those mentors, but you really want to think about having multiple mentors in your particular sphere of influence. All right, last slide, and then we have more time to talk. There's other considerations to be making when you're thinking about academic careers, and I think this is probably an incomplete list. Increasingly, diversity portfolios are an important part of applying for jobs. If you apply for a job at UCSD, you will have to provide a diversity statement, which describes your perspective on diversity and equity, what work you've done in that area, and what do you see as an opportunity, or what plans do you have as a scientist, as a faculty member, whatever position you're applying for, from a diversity perspective. So now is the time to really think about, what areas of equity are important to you, are interesting to you, are something that you think you can contribute to. Now is the time to learn more about what are the issues in equity, particularly in science and engineering. And clue, there's a lot of them, so there's no shortage. And start getting involved now. I know Jen is extremely involved in outreach, and that's one way to sort of start to broach into that. But you may also think about other ways to get involved with, if there's a women in engineering or women in physics program in your group. If there's some kind of conference that you can learn more about the equity issues in your particular community. Start getting involved in these issues, because that is something that is increasingly becoming a standard part of the application for an academic faculty position. Another important challenge is the two-body problem, and Chris has already kind of hinted a little bit about this, about how that they've had to navigate academic careers between he and his spouse. This is both a challenge and sometimes it's an opportunity, right? There's sometimes doors will open because of a two-body problem, and sometimes it's just really, really hard. So I'm going to let Chris talk a little bit more about that if he wants later. But this is also going to be a part of your decision process of what do I want my career to look like? Because it's important that you also consider your partner in part of these discussions. And then the last thing I'll talk about, and this is where, again, I think Chris has more experience, so I'd like him to talk about it, the transition between academia and industry, and from industry back to academia, or vice versa, can be seamless sometimes. It can also be very challenging a lot of the times. It really depends on your field. I can imagine in engineering, it's a little bit more seamless than in a science field like physics. But there are ways to sort of, bring your industry experience as a strength for an academic position. I think many of my colleagues now know that there's a very, most of our students are going on industry positions. And, for myself, I've never worked in industry. I have no way of explaining what industry careers look like. So I think there's increasingly an awareness of having people in academia that also have industry experience is a strength. And so that's going to work well for those of you who want to go back and forth between these areas. It's possible, but it is a challenge. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Okay, that's all my slides. Chris, do you have anything you want to comment on, or maybe some other skills or issues that you think are important?
I mean, you talked over a lot of them. I'm certainly happy to talk about any of these individual things a little bit more. I would agree with Adam that, transitioning to industry is not scary. I think a lot of people think it's scary because by that point you've been in academia for so long that, it's kind of the great unknown. But for a lot of jobs that you would apply for, they're looking for PhD level scientists because they know that PhDs have this kind of way of approaching critical thinking, which is extremely useful for lots of problem solving. So a lot of the jobs that I had interviews in, I was being interviewed by other PhDs, from various backgrounds, people in STEM fields, math, all over the place. So there are probably way more PhDs working in industry than there are teaching in colleges, as shown from Adam's plots, because that's where all of the PhDs have to go. And it's different because you're not necessarily working on your own problems that you come up with, but you are compensated in various other ways out there. Yeah. And as for the two-body problem, I haven't been super, I haven't successfully made the transition to both faculty positions. So once I've done that, I'll give you more updates on that.
Actually, I'm interested in anything you can say about the two-body problem. Maybe your whatever experience you want to share or recommendations you have.
So I think the best lesson that I learned from my wife. And that's that sometimes you have to fight for positions. So when I was going to go out to Boston, because that's literally the only place I got into grad school, she applied for this fellowship out there that she felt like she was a perfect fit for. And they came back and they said, no, sorry, you're not really what we're looking for. But she called up the director of that center and she told her, no, I'm exactly what you're looking for these reasons. And they gave her the job. And my wife always told me that, like, whenever that person was introducing her, they'd always tell her that story because they love that story about how, like, she, like, wanted that position, and she's right, she was good for that position. So I think within reason, you can push back on things if you think that you're a good fit for positions, and maybe you'll get rewarded for that type of tenacity.
Cool, thanks.
I mean, I will say from the department perspective, I have seen over the last 20 years from different departments that the interest in hiring folks who are in relationships has actually gone up, because we often see this as an opportunity to grow and expand. The challenge is always when it's two different departments. It's also challenging in the same department because you're hiring two people and that's two slots. So it's a big deal. But I think I've seen increasingly, at least at UCSD, more interest in supporting these kind of programs. And in fact, our university has a system set up where if, say, two departments, there's a couple that lands in two different departments, they can basically hire both people, and the university actually puts in like a third of the funding for that. So it actually motivates the departments in some degree to do these kind of hires. That being said, it's a challenge, and this is definitely an area where this moving around and these academic positions being very sparse makes it very challenging. I had one point in there. I just want to remind folks that if you are in a two-body situation, and let's say you're applying for a job, my advice is to not mention that until you've had an offer. And that's because there is still resistance by some folks to get involved in two-body hires. And usually what happens is if when they really want to hire you and you're bringing a second person along, they're going to work with you more than if it's something where, well, if we make this offer, we have to deal with this. So that's just kind of a subtle advice. Keep that card close until you've got an offer.
Okay, this is interesting. So when my fiance and I applied to graduate school, we asked the advice of many professors we knew about what we should do with the two-body situation. And we got a full-on 50-50 split. Half of them said, tell them you're applying together, and the other half said, do not tell them. What we ended up doing is only telling the ones, well, okay, she just turned her video on, there she is. What we ended up doing is only telling the ones that we had very strong connections to before we got offers. Then anytime either of us would get an offer, we would also let them know. And so it seems that maybe what you're saying is do what we did on the graduate school side. But I also would like to know, do you think that there is a strong split in advice when it comes to this matter for other faculty members?
So the latter question, I'd say yes. I think there are some people who are far more supportive of this than others. We'll just leave it there. I think the difference between grad school and so I presume grad school, postdoc, and faculty are kind of three places where this is going to be an issue. I think when you're looking at grad school, it's there's already lots of not lots, but there are already grad school positions available, so it's not too much of a stretch to bring in two people at the same time. Typically, in a faculty hire, there's one faculty position, right? And so you have to generate a new faculty position in some way to accommodate a two-body hire. So it's more difficult at that level. And so that's why I say it's often easier. It's probably better to just wait until you get an offer and then offer that information and start negotiating for that. And that's I think that's the important part is that if you have that hire and you're introducing this two-body issue, that's a part of negotiation. When they've made an offer, and that's a reason to wait till the offer. When they made an offer to you, they want you to come. And so now it's time to provide some conditions on that, right? Because you are now valued. So, hey, if you want me, here's some issues that we need to resolve. And it's enough of I think enough universities have had experience with the two-body issue that it's not going to be a surprise or a deal breaker. It's something that the university will work with you on, and your department will work with you on, particularly since they want to hire you. So that's why I say wait till the offer.
I have one other question about this that I always think about. I feel like since I'm female, if I wear my wedding ring and people see that, they will assume I have a two-body problem. With men, I feel like they're more likely to think, oh, the family will move or something. I don't think they'll think that as a woman. And so I always wonder, because sometimes during grad school, I took the ring off during the grad school applications. I wonder whether this is a good idea because it seems sort of sleazy, almost like being dishonest to take off your wedding ring. But I feel like if I'm wearing it, I've already disclosed the two-body problem.
That's a really fantastic question, Eva. And I don't know. I honestly would not have made that assumption if I had seen your wedding ring as you were interviewing. But I couldn't rule out that some would. So that's a deeply fascinating and also very troubling question. In terms of whether you feel sleazy about wearing your wedding ring or not, I wouldn't worry about it, right? If you your job is to get hired, and if you are concerned about this being an issue, take the wedding ring off. It's okay. Yeah, I think a very important thing is that for career things. So this is the other thing is if they ask you if you're married, you do not have to answer that question, right? That's actually, I think, federally forbidden from asking that. So that aspect of your personal life is not relevant at the interview application stage, right? They should not ask you about it. You have you don't have to volunteer anything. And that's why, again, I say wait till the offer, because that's when you have some power and you can, say, now we're going to negotiate. But yeah, you've raised a really really interesting issue. And I, I wish I could say, oh, absolutely, that doesn't happen, but I can imagine, and there's some cases there will be people where that is something that crossed their mind. So I think you're thinking deeply about that.
Thank you.
Are there other questions about academic careers, what to do to prepare for academic careers?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, this question is regarding this transition that happens from being a postdoc to a faculty at the university. And I can imagine, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that doing most of your PhD and postdoc, you do a lot of hands-on research. You're heavily involved in what you're doing. But as you transition to faculty, I can imagine that it's a lot of proposal writing and grant writing. So you don't get to do a lot of hands-on research. So, and I personally don't know if that is what I am looking for. I don't even know where. So at what point do you start getting the taste of being a faculty? Is it in the postdoc position where you start writing more proposals? Or so I am thinking in terms of, should I decide about being a faculty member now, or should I wait till becoming a postdoc where I get to be more like a faculty, more like a mentor than now? So if you can talk a bit more on that, it'll be very helpful for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll let Chris also chime in on this as well. So, if you think about it, when you're applying for postdoc jobs, when you're applying for faculty jobs, you're basically writing proposals, right? Mm-hmm. So, it's important to keep in mind that you're already doing that work anyways in that situation. And it's definitely true. So, again, I'm actually 15 years into being a faculty member, because I was a faculty member at MIT before this. Mm-hmm. And the time I have to do science now is very small. However, I am doing a lot of science through my team, right? Mm-hmm. So my graduate students, my undergraduate students are essentially enacting the vision I have for the kind of research projects we have. And it's at some levels slower and faster because I have more hands, but of course I'm also training at the same time. I think at this stage in my career, I'm okay with that. I'm actually enjoying more of the mentorship and the teaching mm-hmm. than getting down and dirty with my data. So keep in mind that you may evolve in your, what balance of sort of your career you want. When I started as a faculty position, yes, I was writing a lot of proposals, but I actually was also still doing a lot of research. Mm-hmm. The tenure process expects, again, at an R1 institution, that faculty are doing a lot of research, and good institutions and good departments will give their faculty time to do that. Mm-hmm. So, my teaching load as an assistant professor was lower than my teaching load is now. Expectations for service on committees and stuff like that was lower. So I actually had quite a lot of time to do research and a lot of resources. And I had the luxury of not having to apply for a job in a year later, right? So I wasn't in a temporary position. So you can still be very productive as a faculty member. And I know some faculty members that all they do is research. That's they've made the decision, that's where their focus is going to be. So, again, purely from a faculty perspective, you make your job what you want of it. If you want to focus on teaching, you can do that. If you want to focus on research, you can do that. If you want to focus on mentoring, you can do that. Or you can do all three and, never sleep. But you have options in that case. So, and I said that if all you want to do is research, right? You have no mm-hmm. interest in teaching, then that's when you can start thinking about, well, maybe a faculty job is actually not what I want to do, but maybe I can do a government job where I'm going to get paid more. And my job really is just doing research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the point that I wanted to clarify. Yeah. Thanks.
Now, in terms of, you said something about postdoc, do I apply for a job now or do a postdoc or two to kind of get the feel of it?
Yeah.
If a job comes up and it seems like a great job, apply for it.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think this ties into what you were telling in the end of the presentation, and I can still transition from industry to academics, and it's seamless if it is engineering or.
So I'm not an engineer, so I can't really say anything mm-hmm. about that. It could be challenging. It depends on the field. right? I imagine it's easier for engineering because, you know, as an engineer faculty, you're training folks who will go on to industry. So I think there's more value and respect for folks who have the industry experience. But, you know, it is different coming from an industry job to an academic job, right?
Yeah.
The letters look different. You know, you may not have as much published research in the industry. You might be working on things that you can't publish. So, you know, that might reduce your portfolio. So you have to kind of figure out the balance.
Yeah.
Chris, do you want to comment a little bit on this?
Sure. I think, you know, just to add on to what Adam said, it's certainly a good idea every year to reevaluate like where you are and where you want to be, because, you know, one year you might want to be academic tenure track faculty, and the next year you don't want to write another paper for the rest of your life. So then you want to go to industry. That certainly happened for my office mate. So I think it's important to reevaluate. I heard some really good advice from somebody who's been extremely successful in this field, who said, spend 50% of the time doing the job you have and 50% of the time doing the job you want. So if you want a faculty job, then you can start, you know, positioning yourself. Postdocs don't have to mentor. That's not a requirement, but maybe you want to mentor. You want to get that experience of having students doing research under you. Or teaching, like Adam said, getting teaching positions, because those aren't necessarily offered to you. You have to go and like look for them and apply to them. And I completely agree with what Adam said about applying for any job that sounds interesting to you. You know, if you don't get it, then you're back where you were anyway. And even if you make a long list or a short list, that's all good experience for the next one if you don't get that one. And the other thing that I would say, at least for people transitioning to industry, Adam mentioned that, you know, in engineering, it's probably a little more frequent for people to flip-flop backwards. But certainly in our field, that is very rarely seen, partially because I think once people leave, they're genuinely happy, so they don't see a need to come back. But also the things that are valued in industry aren't necessarily the things valued in academia, such as writing papers, which you are probably not doing a whole lot in industry. So the metrics by which you're judged are very different. And when you try and come back to academia from industry, it's harder. But that being said, you know, you could stay in academia as long as you want, because you can go to industry anytime.
Yeah.
Like industry will always accept you with open arms.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much.
Other questions?
Piggybacking on that question a bit, I just haven't had much exposure to the research scientist world. I was wondering if you could sort of describe where to start and sort of how much of it do you feel when you said research scientists, were you describing the intersection with academic research scientists? Because I know those exist, or more of the, you know, like the government lab, et cetera.
So both of those exist. You know, in our, so we, Chris and I both work in the Center for Astrophysics and Space Science. So does Jen. And we have several research scientists in our sort of center who are essentially soft money scientists. So in an academic area, typically the research scientist position is called a soft money position. And what that means is that you're essentially raising your salary through grants. There are other opportunities to get funding as an instructor at UCSD, but predominantly folks who are in the research science position are essentially professional researchers who raise their own salary. Now that, for me, that sounds like frightening. But I think some folks who are very good at writing grants and are successful at that, this is a great way to have actually a career where you essentially have full control of whatever you're doing. And I have several colleagues that either are based at institutions like UCSD, or in some cases are essentially independent researchers that raise their own funding through salaries. And the great thing about raising your own funding through your own salary through funding is you can set your own salary through funding. So depending on successful year, you can have a very good year. A more common, so that's one area of research scientists. A more common approach is that you'll have research scientists that work at either a government lab, say NASA JPL or Goddard or something like that, or who might work at a private institution. So Carnegie Observatories in Pasadena is an example of that. I'm not sure in all areas of science or in physical science and engineering how many of those kind of things exist. But that is a path that many, at least astronomers, will pursue, where they are they're not required to raise their salary in a private institution, but they are expected to do fundraising and raise up money for that. And their main job is to do research. So they're really focused exclusively on that. So the benefits are, if you really want to focus on a research career, that's a way of getting rid of all of the other things that a faculty member has to do, right? I have to teach, I have to serve on committees, I have to do lots of little stuff that gets in the way of my research time. But the other side of it is that often you may be responsible for raising your salary, which means you are constantly proposing for new grants, new ideas. If that's something you're comfortable doing, and of course you'll get lots of practice with it, so you'll get very good at it, that's one opportunity. But it's also one where you're going to have to really, you're really going to have to hustle to make sure that you've got yourself funded.
Thank you. No, that sounds both fascinating. I understand why you say it's a bit scary too. I get that point of view. But yeah, no, that sounds very cool.
Yeah.
To add to that, like I said, if you love what you do and that type of position is what you want, and you're scared about, having to do such fundraising all the time, you can ride it out as long as you can, because once again, industry will always be there to catch you when you fall. So do what you love for as long as you can, I would recommend.
That's a great point. No, thanks, Chris.
I should say we have a research scientist that's affiliated with our group that has been in that position, I think now for about 8 years, and he's been able to keep his salary going the entire time. And he really is totally independent. He works on whatever he wants, and he's very successful at it.
Does he normally get the money from a?
I think, does he get the money? He gets from NASA and NSF grants.
Mostly from like the same few threads of research. Does he keep those going, or is he trying new things constantly?
He is trying new things constantly. So he has kind of a few different directions. And I should say that's actually not uncommon for academic researchers. So we often have, well, I guess it depends on the field, but we'll often have kind of a few directions that we're pursuing. And if one is, funded, then you follow that train. But he's also, I think because of his position, he's also open to trying new things. So he mostly works on young stars and white dwarfs, these kind of remnants of stars. But he's also interested in asteroid deflection, because there's a lot of money in defending the Earth from asteroids. And so he sees that as an opportunity to kind of get involved in that kind of research, because there's funding opportunities in that. So, again, and I'm just speaking for this one example, but that research scientist has the sort of mindset that he's interested in lots of different things. And if there's something that is, sounds cool and has funding associated, he'll run to it. Whereas, because I have so many other things going on, I have to kind of keep a steady research portfolio going. So I'm a little less easy to jump from different directions. So this, again, will touch on, and this goes back to your kind of academic, philosophy. Are you someone that's kind of autodidactic and you want to try different things? Or are you going to just kind of stick with one, research area for a long time? And that may also govern kind of what job is best for you.
That's a great point. Thank you.
Yeah.
I would also say, the one thing that we've talked about is these kind of two main career paths, either academic or industry. But there's this whole other thing that you could be doing. Adam very well knows a physics girl who, created her own career as a YouTuber and blogger, just doing science education, which is incredible. And there's this person called Jorge Sham who wrote PhD comics when he was in grad school. And I don't believe he finished grad school, but he still does PhD comics. He made a whole career out of PhD comics. And I think the same thing is true for Lego grad student, who has like lots of very interesting ways that they market their materials. So there are lots of other things that you can also do while in grad school. And grad school is a good way to figure out who you are and what you enjoy doing, because you're never going to get as much freedom as you have right now in this moment, guaranteed. Maybe postdoc, but I don't think so personally.
Okay, well, we're coming up to the top of the hour, and I know some folks already had to leave. Is there any last questions that we can answer before we go? Okay, well, if some